Hey everyone, Professor Davis here. We're going to be looking at biology, the study of life in this particular video. This is going to be what we would consider part of like a general biology type course. So when we look at this whole idea of the study of life, biology really means this. If you break the word down, bio means life and ology means the study of. But when we look at this, what makes something alive? What determines if this particular thing, whatever it may be, is living or non-living? Okay, and so when we look at this, there are some characteristics, and we're going to look at 8 that do make something alive, and this is all living things. Because if we talk about a human being alive, there's going to be certain things like we say, oh, they're breathing, and their brain is functioning, and their heart is beating. But not all organisms that are living have those types of structures like we do. So let's look at the general characteristics of all living things. First of all living things have to have some sort of order or organization that's present. The basic unit of life is the cell, and the cell is very organized in its structure. We're actually going to talk about it in another video. When we look at the cell, though, the cells then are going to be organized in certain ways all the way up to what we would consider all life on Earth, which is the biosphere. And there's an organization there as well. The second thing that we do see is that life is going to respond to stimuli. There is some sort of sensitivity or response that happens to a stimulus. So we see this, like when you touch something hot, the stimulus is going to make you want to pull your hand back. Your response is to get away from that hot substance, okay, because you don't want to get burned. Other organisms can also do this. Some plants, when you touch them, they withdraw, they pull away, or they close up their flower. They have a way of responding to the stimuli that they're coming in contact with. Another one is reproduction. All living things have to be able to reproduce. Now, there are two means or two ways reproduction takes place. The first is asexual reproduction, where we go from one cell to two, and these cells are genetically the same as the one it started with because there was only one parent. When we look at sexual reproduction, this means there are two parents, and so we have the gametes, the sex cells like egg and sperm, come together and fuse to make a brand new individual, and that individual is unique in that structure. So this gives us variety when we look at sexual reproduction. Now, in reality with humans, we actually do both. We have sexual reproduction to produce a new organism, a new human being. But on the other hand, our body cells go through asexual reproduction when we grow and we repair. The next thing is that life has to be able to adapt. We call these adaptations, okay? And so kind of similar to this whole idea of responding to stimuli, sometimes the organism needs to be able to adapt if that stimuli or condition becomes a little more prevalent or permanent, or it lasts a little longer. And so we've got to see that that organism has to be able to adapt, or it would potentially die. Another is life does have to grow and develop. And this again can be where one cell grows to be bigger before it splits into two, or the organism grows larger because it gets more cells. Okay, but this whole process though of going from where it's smaller to larger is also part of that developmental process. 6 here is where life requires regulatory mechanisms. We have things that are going to help regulate the cell and help us be able to survive those different kind of circumstances in our environment, those stimuli that we come in contact with. And this is known as homeostasis. If you break this word down, homeo means same and stasis means like status. And so we have, if you think about it, we have a internal body temperature that we try to maintain. The average is 98.6. Now, your body's going to work at trying to keep your body temperature where it needs to be. So if you're hot, it's going to start causing you to sweat. If you're cold, you're going to shiver. The whole point there is that it's trying to help maintain your temperatures. We see the same thing with like glucose. You eat a big old piece of cake, lots of sugar, your glucose level in your blood rises. So your body's going to release a hormone to help bring it back down, or at least we hope it does. So this is what we're looking at here with some of that regulatory mechanism. Now, other organisms may do it a little different, but they do have that process called homeostasis. Also, life is going to use materials and energy. We call this metabolism. all the chemical reactions that a cell undergoes is their metabolism. And this is how they are able to transfer energy from one type to the next. How we get energy from the food we consume in order to create ATP for our cells. Okay, it's actually a transfer of energy instead of a creation of energy. And so life has to have that ability to be able to transition or process types of energy. Last but not least in this list is life has to be able to evolve. Now, evolution is going to mean change over time. So individually, we cannot evolve, okay? Individual organisms cannot evolve. There's not enough time for that to take place. However, a population of organisms that are the same are going to potentially have evolution take place over time as their environment changes. If they can't keep up with that environmental change, what happens then is those organisms go extinct. And so evolution is a big part of this to help us be able to survive as conditions around us constantly change. All right, so when we look at this whole idea of a hierarchy of cellular organization, because that was the first thing on the list there, cells are going to be the basic unit of life. Okay, so the cell is the basic unit of life. However, a group of cells are going to work together to create what we call a tissue. Now, there are 4 types of tissues that are out there. There's epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. Now, these tissues can then also work together to make up our organs. Okay, so an organ where they are going to have a specific job, where your heart has a different job than your stomach, and your stomach has a different job than your kidneys, okay, your organs. Now, these organs then are going to work together to make organ systems. So if you see the heart here, the heart is going to work together with other organs like your blood vessels and your blood tissue in order to make sure that you have a cardiovascular system. And this cardiovascular system works all together. Now, when all your organ systems are working together, you have the actual organism. In this case, you have an elk. That organism is successful because all of its organ systems are working like it should. Now, these organisms are going to then be organized into a population. A population contains all the same species of that organism. Populations then work together to create communities. Now, communities are going to be all the living things in that community, and they are going to react in certain ways. This is how food webs and food chains are going to be developed. The next thing we see is the ecosystem. Now, the ecosystem takes it a step further. So at the community level, we're only looking at the living things. The ecosystem level, we're looking at the living and non-living things. So not only are we looking at all the animals, all the organisms, all the plants that are in a community, we're also looking in the ecosystem at the weather patterns, the rainfall, the type of soil that's around. We may also look at any other non-living type of influence. So the ecosystem is looking at what we call the abiotic factors, which are the non-living factors, as well as the biotic factors, which are the living. And then the biosphere is, of course, planet Earth. Now, in this series, when we look at more of like a general biology 1 course, we're going to be looking at the green ones here. We're going to be looking at the cellular level up to where we start to talk a little bit about organisms. Whereas if you were to take more of a biology 2 type of course, you're going to be looking more at the evolution and the ecosystems and the communities that take place. Now, one thing to note though is that cells do have some things that we need to address, and we are going to look at a video where we're going to look at a little bit of some non-living things with some chemistry. We're going to have to look at atoms and molecules. Now, there's a number of reasons we need to do this. Is atoms and molecules make up a big part of what is important to us as cells or organisms, living things. One specifically is H2O, which is water. So we'll talk a little bit about how water is so important. But we're also going to be looking at things like organic molecules like carbohydrates, proteins, okay, nucleic acids. Those are all super important for a cell to also be successful. So we are going to look at a little bit of chemistry here as well. Now, here's just another picture that shows you this kind of hierarchy that we talked about, this order going from the atom all the way up to the biosphere. And again, if we're looking at this side of it, so a lot of times in a Bio 1 course, we're going to see that we look at the studying of the chemistry and also the cellular structures and functions. Whereas if you go to the other parts where we're looking at more of the organisms, how they interact in the environment with the ecosystem and community, as well as the planet Earth as a whole, that's more of like a biology 2 type course. All right, so let's get real quick on evolution a little closer. Evolution is a unifying kind of concept in biology. It explains both the unity and the diversity of life here on planet Earth. And so when we look at this, this is what helps create kind of like these little family trees. A lot of times they're known as phylogenetic trees, or also known as types of cladograms. This is going to allow us to look at who that common ancestor is at a particular point, where we're looking at a certain group. We do see as we move up this particular family tree, there is some sort of change that's going to take place, and that change is the evolution. This allows us to have the diversity of life that we see here, where there's these branches that are present, and each of these organisms are going to be a little bit different. So when we look at this, the base of this tree represents the past, whereas those branches are where we're looking at more of the present. All right, this brings us to something that's really important when we're looking at living things, and this is known as taxonomy. Taxonomy is a part of biology that's concerned with identifying and grouping organisms together. Now, typically this is based on their evolutionary relationships. However, the more we learn about like DNA and certain other types of evidence, taxonomy may change and adjust as we get more information. Now, some sources of data where we get this information to put these organisms into group are going to include things like the fossil records. Now, the fossil records do have quite a few holes in them because fossils are only left behind by the hard parts of an organism. And so there are going to be some things or pieces missing in that fossil record due to the soft tissues that a lot of organisms do have. We also see that we look at things like comparative anatomy. If we look at these different structures on different organisms, they do have some similarities to them. We're able to compare them. And so here you can see a human arm. You can also see a cat's leg, bat's wing, a porpoise's or dolphin's fin, and then a horse's leg. They do have similar structures to them. They do have one bone that's at the upper part that connects to the torso of the organism. We see that there are also two bones that are in the middle part that we would call mostly our forearm. And then you do have some structures here that represent like the wrist and the phalanges that are very similar through all of these different groups. Now, if you remember though, all of these going from human, cat, bat, porpoise, and horse, they're all mammals. Since we're all in that same group of being mammals, we do see some anatomy that is similar. Another thing, and this is the big one right now, that's the push now that we know more and more about DNA and that technology of analyzing it, this is actually the biggest driving force right now in taxonomy. So taxonomy is ever changing, and the big question is why? Well, new technology leads to new knowledge, and new knowledge may let us know that we were kind of maybe wrong in what we thought before. And that's okay, because again, the more information we know, the better we can make kind of these decisions and these groupings of these organisms. So as technology changes, as technology provides more new research, this allows us to make and adjust the taxonomy. Now, when we look at taxonomy, there are 8 groups. We call them 8 taxons, and they are part of this system, and they're used in this idea of naming and classifying organisms. And we're going to go first from the broadest, and we're going to then come down to the most specific when we're looking at these taxonomy. So domain is going to be the broadest. It's the most inclusive, and they share general characteristics, not specific ones, just general. And these are the ones where we're just that we're distantly related to other organisms that are in this group. And there are 3 domains. Now, back when I was in school, in like elementary, junior high, high school, we didn't even have domains really. They were first coming into play at the beginning or the end of my high school career. We talked more about kingdoms. But again, as more information came through, this is where the domain system then was developed. Now, the domains are then followed by kingdoms. Kingdoms are more specific. But they're still not super specific. And when we look at kingdoms, we have 4 kingdoms that we will look at. Then you have phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, you do need to know these in order. Okay, you do need to know them in order, but there are different ways that you could learn these. A lot of times mnemonics are used where where you'll use the first letter of each of the terms in order to create a sentence. That sentence can then help you remember the order. And so some of those sentences are here. You have domineering King Philip came over for good soup. Or you could have another one where do kings play chess on fuzzy green stools? But you can make up your own. You could also go online and look at all different other ones that are made out there. But the whole point is to make sure that you know them in order, from the broadest to the most descriptive. The ones where those are closely related and they share not just general characteristics, but very specific characteristics. So if you'll notice here, we go from most to least. So most inclusive to least inclusive, general to specific, and distantly related to closely related. All right, so let's look at an example here where we're talking about an animal. In this particular case, we're going to look at the American black bear. And so if you look over here at domain, okay, this far side over here where we look at domain, the domain is going to be where we are looking at anything that has eukaryotic cells because it's in the domain eukarya. This is things all the way from single-celled organisms all the way up to that black bear. And it has lots of variety. Okay, as we go through, this even includes plants, right? But then we're going to go into the kingdom. The kingdom then is going to get more specific, and this is kingdom Animalia. And since we're talking about Animalia, this is the animal kingdom, so we lose some of those single-celled organisms like protists. We lose the fungus. We lose the plants because they can no longer belong in this group because now we're in kingdom Animalia. We then go to phylum Chordata. Phylum Chordata means that they have a backbone. So some animals don't have a backbone. Those cannot continue on to that group. This includes things like sponges or starfish or even insects. Now again, I can get even more specific where we have our class Mammalia. Mammalia means that they have fur. They feed their young with milk. Okay, so normally they have some sort of type of fur present and they feed their young milk. Okay, so again, fish aren't part of this. Reptiles couldn't be part of this group. Amphibians. So they do not get to move on to this. Order here is now carnivora. Carnivora means that they eat meat. So you've got individuals like your zebra and your dolphin that don't get to move on to that group. So then we have Ursidae, which is that family of bears. Okay, so you have Ursidae, which is the family of bears. And then you have genus Ursus. Now, with this genus, we're getting more specific. And then finally, the species, you'll notice there's only one thing in it. And this is the American black bear, which is the Ursus americanus. So these are going to be where it's very specific. All right, so we went from broad to specific. Now, who's accredited for doing this? Who is the scientist who kind of gets to stake claim on this idea of taxonomy? Well, this guy was Carlos Linnaeus. He was accredited for this binomial nomenclature. Now, let's break that down. Binomial means two name system. So bi is two, nomial means name. Okay, so this is a two name system that he came up with here. Now, in this two-part system, these are scientific names. And these scientific names are going to contain two parts. That's why it's called binomial. So the species name is made up of the genus and the specific epithet. So the genus is what group it's part of, and the specific epithet gives you a description about it, some sort of descriptive name normally about it. So the example here when we look at this is man. So human, the human race, what is its scientific name? Well, the scientific name is Homo sapiens. So Homo is the genus and sapiens is the specific epithet. And in order to have a species name, both have to be present. They both have to be there. Now you're going to notice that this is going to be written in a certain way. The genus is always capitalized. The specific epithet is not. Okay? Also, if you're typing it out, you can italicize it. That's what we're supposed to do. However, if you're handwriting it, you can't italicize while you handwrite, so you would need to underline it. You'll also notice that this is not in English. This is in Latin. It's in Latin for a reason. Okay, it's the typical language used when we look at science, and the reason being is that it's a universal language of scholars. It's a language that's not changing right now. It's considered a dead language. So think about the English that you speak now. English you speak now is not the same English your parents spoke or your grandparents spoke. We have slang terms that come into play. We have different ways that we use words. And so because of that, we don't want to use any kind of language that is constantly changing right now. And Latin is one of those that's not. It's a dead language. In research publications, it's really important that we do use the scientific name for organisms because it could be confusing. Let me show you why. So I've got a couple examples here. This first animal right here, if we just use its basic everyday name, in some places in the world, this is called a woodchuck. In other places, it's called a whistle pig. And down here where I live, it's called a groundhog. So it depends on your location. However, its scientific name is always the same. And so we should use those scientific names. Another example here is locust. If we say locust, is it a cicada or is it a grasshopper? It depends on what part of the world you're in. Certain parts of the world, when you say locust, they picture a grasshopper in their brain. Others, if you say locust, they see a cicada. So it depends. Because of this confusion, we need to use the Latin scientific names. So guys, classification system that's commonly used has 3 domains. These 3 domains then are going to have 4 kingdoms. So the 3 domains include archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Those are our 3 domains. The kingdoms are going to be protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. And the big thing we want to look at here is when we put these organisms into groups, we're going to look at certain things. Like 1, what type of cells do they have? Do they have prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells? That may determine where they go in a group. What's their level of organization? Are they unicellular or multicellular? How do they obtain their nutrition? Are they autotrophic or heterotrophic? Do they reproduce sexually or asexually? And last, how do they respond? Are they motile where they can move or are they non-motile? These are things that help us determine what groups these organisms are going to go in. So some basic things we need to look at here. First of all, prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. Now guys, a prokaryotic is a cell that has no nucleus. The name tells you that. Pro means before, karyo means nucleus. A lot of times these don't have any organelles either. The only exception is the ribosome. Every other organelle will not be present. So these are more simple cells in the grand scheme of things. On the other hand, eukaryotic cells, they do have a nucleus and they do have various organelles. So they're going to be a little more complex. They also tend to be a little larger. The next one is unicellular and multicellular. Uni means one. So unicellular means it's made of one cell, whereas multicellular means it's made of many cells. Autotrophic and heterotrophic. Autotrophic means they make their own food. An example of this is they do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is what plants do by using the sunlight to create their own food. On the other hand, like us, heterotrophic organisms, we have to get our food from our surroundings. We either absorb it or ingest it. We ingest it. You have to actually put it into your mouth, chew it up, and ingest it in order for you to get what you need. Other organisms like fungus, they actually liquefy their food and then they absorb it, like suck it up. All right, so these are some terms that are going to be important as we go through this set of lectures. All right, so I have a little chart here that we're going to look at here, and we're going to break down the different domains as well as the kingdoms. So I have first here domain archaea. This is the bacteria that live in extreme environments. Now used to, guys, all the bacteria was in the same group, but we found that they were not really the same. So archaea are your extremists. They like extreme hot, they like really salty conditions, they like acid, they like those types of conditions. Now when we look at archaea as compared to bacteria, archaea like to be in specific places, very extreme. Bacteria can live almost everywhere. They can live in soil, air, water, in you, on you. Okay, they can live almost anywhere. Now, if you look at the structure of archaea and bacteria, they are very similar. They have the less complex cells because they're prokaryotic. They are also unicellular organism. So where's the difference? Well, the difference is going to be based mostly on where they live, those extreme conditions. The way they get their food also varies. Some archaea and some bacteria, they can do photosynthesis. Others can do what they call chemosynthesis because they can use chemicals to make their own food. Some of them are going to consume food and they're heterotrophic. So their mode of nutrition varies. It's different. Now let's look at the domain eukarya. Now the domain eukarya are going to be made up of cells that are eukaryotic, thus the name. This domain can be broken up into 4 kingdoms: Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So let's look at Protista first. Some examples of Protista are things like water and slime molds, algae, and protozoa. Fungi examples are things like mushrooms and yeast. Plant, you have mosses, ferns, trees, and any of your flowering plants. And animalia, there's a huge group. They range from sponges. Yes, sponges are the simplest animal and they do not walk around like SpongeBob. All the way up to very complex animals like ourselves, which are in the group of mammalia. Now let's look at some organization here. These organisms are going to be more complex. Because of this, they are eukaryotic cells, meaning they contain a nucleus and various organelles. Now, if we're looking at the group Protista, those are mostly unicellular. There is an exception though. Seaweed is not a plant. It's a protist in Protista, and it is multicellular. Now, if we look at the rest of these groups, fungi, plantae, and animalia, they are larger and more complex, just like Protista is. They are also eukaryotic. Okay, so there's not any difference there. A difference does come when it talks about unicellular. Not all other organisms are unicellular. When we look at fungi, fungi are multicellular. There again is an exception, and yeast, the yeast you can buy at the store, is a living thing. It is unicellular. Each one of those is a single cell. Now, plantae and animalia, they are all multicellular. There are no exceptions to those groups. Now, let's talk about food. When we talk about animalia, they are going to be heterotrophic, meaning they ingest their food. They take it into their body somehow, and then they digest it. Plants, on the other hand, do make their own food. They do this via photosynthesis. Fungi is also heterotrophic, but it doesn't ingest the food like we do. It digests it outside of the body and then absorbs it into their body. And if we look at Protista, Protista is going to vary because it has 3 little groups that kind of act like the other kingdoms. So if you look at Protozoa, Protozoa are known as the animal-like protists. They act a little like animals, but they're not complex enough to be animals. Algae act like plants, but they're not complex enough to be plants. And water and slime molds are going to act like fungi. But again, they are not complex enough to be in the fungi group. And so because of this mode of nutrition for Protista, it will vary. Now guys, one way to look at Protista is it's the junk drawer of the kingdoms. You know that drawer you have in your house that has just random stuff in it, like pins that don't write and tape and a screwdriver and then who knows what else? It's just got random stuff in it. That's Protista. It's like, you know what? You're close to being a plant, but you're not quite a plant, so we're going to put you in Protista and you're an algae. You know, you're close to being an animal, but you're not quite an animal, so you're going to go in Protista and you're going to be a protozoa. That is what that kingdom is kind of like. And that was this is also one of the kingdoms that's probably going to be revamped pretty soon. All right, now we're going to switch gears a second. So we did a brief overview a little bit of the groups of biology and with taxonomy. Let's talk a little bit about some of the branches of biological study. Now, the study of biology is the study of life, which means there's a lot of sub things that could be studied here. So I want to hit on a few of them because maybe some of this might interest you and it might spark some sort of passion in you for biology. So we have microbiologists. Microbiologists are going to study little things like bacteria and all those single-celled or unicellular organisms. Molecular biology looks at like DNA and RNA, all the little molecules that are part of that. Neurobiology is going to focus in on the nervous system. Ecology focuses on the big picture. Okay, so it's looking more at like how ecosystems work together, whether it's the community component or also the non-living component. Genetics is looking specifically only at DNA. Zoology is the study of not zoos, but animals. That's why zoos get their name, because they contain animals. So zoology is the study of animals. Botany is the study of plants. Physiology is where you study how the different living things work. Okay, so physiology is how it works. So this is why sometimes you'll hear about anatomy and physiology. So you're looking at the body structure and then how it works. And we do see that there is a lot of biological science when it comes to forensics. A lot of forensic scientists have had some sort of biology degree. There's a lot of like sub branches that are part of biology. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what science is in general. Science is defined as the knowledge about the natural world. In its basic, pure form, it seeks to expand knowledge regardless of the short-term application of that knowledge. And when we look at the applied side of it with technology, it's to try to aim and solve world problems. Now, doesn't always work, but that's what they're trying to accomplish. Now, when we look at science, there's some pros when it comes to science. In many ways, science has improved our lives, especially in the field of medicine. We have lots of different medicines out there, and it's actually increased the life expectancy of individuals that have been developed. So things like antibiotics, vaccines, treatments for cancers and genetic disorders, all of this allows people to live longer. On the other hand, there are some cons. In some ways, science has generated concerns in research fields such as like stem cell research, cloning. There is a thing that is being looked at called designer babies, gene therapy, genetically engineered foods. You may hear of them as GMOs. We also see gene farming. Xenotransplantation is when we transplant tissues from other animals into human. Transgenic animals, selective breeding, genetic screening, and even the Human Genome Project, where we mapped out all of the DNA of the human cell. These are all possible topics for what we're going to be looking at a little bit later when we get to biotechnology. Now, if you noticed, a lot of this didn't talk about the responsibility that science has. So science in its pure form just wants to answer questions, okay? The problem is when we answer some of those questions, how we get to them and the technology that's used to get to them, there is some social responsibility with it, with sometimes a moral side of should we be doing that. So science is impartial. It's simply attempts to study the natural world. That's it. Science does not make ethical and moral decisions. However, we live in a world where we have to make those decisions. Science doesn't make them, but the scientist may have to make them. Society or people have a role of responsibility on deciding how best to use scientific knowledge. How does it benefit living things, and should we do it? Now, guys, science is objective. Okay? It's not subjective. So if a question comes up and it's objective, there's a good chance we can study it in science. But if it's subjective, we cannot. And this is where the scientific method is then going to come in. So if it's objective, it's without any prejudice or bias. If it's subjective, it's affected by your personal views. So an example, these are morals, ethics, and religious views that could come into play. So an example here, a question that could be answered that's objective and could be answered by science is, why is a plant green? We can scientifically look at plants and figure out why they're green, and we know it's green because of chlorophyll, and how chlorophyll has a pigment that's going to absorb light and reflect green to your eye. We've been able to prove that. On the other hand, a question that science cannot prove or look into, that's subjective, is what is the best chocolate chip cookie recipe? Science can't answer that because every person on this planet probably has a different idea of what the best is. Some people like nuts in their chocolate chip cookies. Others like lots of chocolate chips. Some may only want a few chocolate chips. Some may like them real chewy where others want them real soft. That right there is a subjective question, something that science cannot answer. So this does bring us to the scientific method. The scientific method is an approach used to gather factual information in order to explain a certain phenomenon. Now, the scientific method has 4 basic steps, okay, that you need to know these steps. Okay, step one is observation. This presents a question. Okay, it makes you start thinking about something. So this allows you to use your past studies to help you explain something. Sometimes this is using the internet or library research to help you. Or it could be a new phenomenon, something that you've never seen before or never has been studied before. The second thing that develops then is a hypothesis. Guys, a hypothesis is an educated guess. It's a tentative statement which is subject to change. It might not be right, and that's okay. Okay, but we make a statement and we are going to then test it. So a hypothesis has to be testable. Okay, we have to be able to test that educated guess. Step 3 is the actual testing. We do an experiment. We then collect data through that experiment and we try to see if it supports our hypothesis. Does it support it or does it reject it? This is what brings us to the last state, which is the conclusion. When we add all the results together, the lab experience, the field observations, whatever kind of data collection that we are doing, this can lead us to a conclusion. The conclusion is the analysis of that data, and it allows us to either support or disprove the hypothesis. It sends us back to number 2. Do we need to rework it? Do we need to revamp it a little bit? Or was it correct? Okay, this is that scientific method. So we have observation, hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion. Now, it is customary that when you complete your research, you come to a conclusion that you should get it looked at by peers. You let them do the same experiment and see if they get the same results. This is why we print things and publish things in scientific journals, so that they can see the design of the experiment and somebody else can also try it. And if they can recreate it, it's repeatable, then that hypothesis sometimes can end up moving to something else. And we call that next step from a hypothesis a theory. Now, this whole idea of using the scientific method can be done by using 2 types of reasoning. We can use inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. Now, inductive means I start with a specific case, and then this leads me to more of a general idea. On the other hand, deductive means I started with something general, and I moved to something more specific. Okay, and guys, science can work either way. So if we look at this, we can go from specific to general. This goes from observation to hypothesis. This would be inductive reasoning. And then we can go general back to more specific, where we test the hypothesis and we come up with that experimental design through deductive reasoning. This allows us to come up with statements for hypothesis like, if I do this, then this will happen. Helps us make those guesses. If I change this, this will occur. Okay, and so this is using inductive and deductive reasoning, and in science we use both. Now, inductive reasoning allows the scientist to form a hypothesis and theories based on a specific observation, whereas deductive reasoning helps the scientist be able to design an experiment and test their hypothesis. Now, when we come up with an experiment, there are some things we got to make sure are present. The first is the experimental variable. The experimental variable is the component of the experiment being tested. It's the cause that will ultimately then determine an effect. It's the one factor that you are deliberately altering or changing. So as the scientist, it's the one thing that you're changing. It is also known as your independent variable. On the other hand, you also have what we call your responding variable. This is the result of the change you made. This is going to what you're going to measure because of what you caused with your experimental variable. This is the effect. This is also known as your dependent variable because it depends on the experimental variable. We also need to make sure there's a control group. The control group is the sample group that goes through all the steps of the experiment except the one being tested. So the experimental variable does not go here. This helps validate your results. In a lot of medical tests, we call this group the placebo group. They think they may be getting whatever it is, but they're really not. This gives us something to compare our results to. And last but not least, then you have the test group. So the control group is the one that does not have the experimental variable. The test group is the group that does. And sometimes you'll have different test groups depending on what kind of experimental variable you have. So here's an example, okay? I've got an experiment here, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at 3 plants. We are going to give them everything the same pot, the same type of plant, the same amount of sunlight, same soil. The thing we're going to change is the water. Okay, so what is the possible hypothesis being tested here? Well, does the amount of water affect the plant's growth? So the amount of water they're getting, does it affect the plant's growth? So what's the experimental variable? The experimental variable is the amount of water. It's the one thing I'm changing. If you notice here, plant 1's getting no water. Plant 2 is getting 20 mLs. Plant 3 is getting 40 mLs. What's the responding variable? This is what I want to measure. I want to measure the growth of the plant. So I want to measure the growth of the plant. Now, what about our groups? The control group is the one that's not undergoing the experimental variable. So this is plant number 1 because it's getting no water. The test groups where the water is changing are going to be groups 2 and 3. Now, what other factors can affect the plant's growth? Well, there's a lot of stuff. Sunlight, type of light, soil, fertilizer, pot size, type of water, type of plant, plant's age. These things have to be standardized. Everything that we can control, we need to. So we need to make sure that if we put one plant out for 20 minutes in the sun, all plants go out for 20 minutes in the sun. And they all go the same time. We all use the same type of a soil, the same type of pot. Those are the things we need to make sure we standardize because we want to see if water is affecting the plant and nothing else. Okay, so it's important to also standardize all the other parts of the experiment. So guys, if you look at this overview of the scientific method, you can see that you have observation, hypothesis, testing, and conclusion. Very similar to what we saw in the couple of slides before. Okay. Now remember, if we print our conclusion, we print our experiment, and we can then get it retested over and over again by our peers. This then it can then be turned into what we call a scientific theory. A scientific theory arises out of scientists using the scientific method, but it's not actually a step of the scientific method. It's a result of it, but it's not a step of the scientific method. So guys, there are some scientific theories that we want to talk about in biology. This is a conceptual scheme supported over many years. And this is due to lots and lots of research, lots of support from the scientific method. Some examples of these theories include the cell theory, gene, homeostasis, ecosystem, and evolution. So let's talk about the cell theory first real quick. There are 3 tenets to the cell theory. The cell theory says that all living things are composed of cells. It also says that cells are the basic structural and fundamental unit of life. Okay, so all living things are made of cells, and cells are the basic structure of life. And the last part is cells come from pre-existing cells. So they have to come from another cell. Now this is why the cell theory is still a theory though. It's not called the cell law because where did the first cell come from? This is where we aren't real sure because nobody lived all the way back then and saw the first one with whether it's through the Big Bang or if you believe something else. The thing is that pre-existing cell is super important. Okay. Now, Another thing we need to look at is the fact that cells do reproduce. And cells reproduce and come from pre-existing cells is known as biogenesis. Bio means life, genesis means the beginning. Reproduction perpetuates the species, and they can either do this through asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is where one organism splits into two. The offspring are identical. This is normally seen with unicellular organisms like bacteria. However, sexual reproduction is the union of sex cells, sperm and egg. Offspring then undergoes various stages of development to then become what we would call an adult. Offspring here are not genetically identical. They are going to be unique and different from their parents, and these are associated mostly with multicellular organisms. Now, living cells do undergo metabolism. Okay, so metabolism is another one we're going to look at here. This is the processes that convert nutrients like food into energy. Metabolism's all the chemical reactions inside the body of an organism, and energy is the capacity to do work. Now, cells need this energy to do work because they need to maintain their organization, as that takes a lot of energy. Think about a backpack or a bag you have and you had it all organized. It took you a long time probably to organize it, a lot of work. Did it take very long for it to get disorganized? Probably not. It takes lots of energy to keep organization constant. Another one is that energy is needed for reproduction, also to respond, and to grow and repair. Now, where does this energy come from? Ultimately, all energy comes from the sun. The ultimate source of energy is the sun, and this is for plants and animals. Plants are just the ones who can access that sun directly. They can do the process of photosynthesis where they can access that sunlight and convert it from sun energy, solar energy, to chemical energy. They do this through that process of photosynthesis. Okay, these are known as the autotrophs or the self-feeders. Sometimes they're also called the producers. On the other hand, animals are then going to eat the plants. They eat those plants. They're the heterotrophs. They ingest or absorb them, and we are then known as the consumers because we consume our food instead of producing it. Another theory we want to look at is called the gene theory. Genes are the hereditary unit. They contain DNA. Okay, so they are going to code for a particular protein. That's what a gene does. And it's going to help with some sort of form and function. Now, mutations can occur. So an example of a gene is melanin. Melanin is a protein that is made by cells that contributes to our skin tone. Ultimately, that skin tone, the more melanin you have, it's going to help prevent UV damage. It's going to give you more natural protection. So this is just an example of a type of gene. A gene mutation can lead to something called albinism. Albinism in this case means that they don't produce any melanin. They produce no pigment for their skin. Okay, and so this could be a type of mutation. So genes, guys, are the basic unit of heredity. DNA is the large spiral double helix molecule that contains those genes that are found in our cells. And genes control the form, which is the structure, and the function of all cells and organisms. A gene mutation is a permanent change in that DNA structure, and the protein is actually what's made from that code. So the gene codes for something, and ultimately it codes for a protein. Some applications that look at gene theory and gene research are going to be genetic research, medicine, and relationships between species. All right, the theory of homeostasis. This is organisms have an internal environment that must be maintained within a constant range. Now, it's not exact. There's normally like a window, but it's not very big window here. So homeostasis is the maintenance of an internal condition with specific boundaries. And feedbacks are the integrate mechanisms that help the organism maintain homeostasis. Now, this is under involuntary control, meaning the nervous system or endocrine system is going to do this for us. Now, negative feedback systems are going to reverse the condition. So these work kind of like your air conditioner in your house. So you set it at a certain temperature that you want your house to be, and when the temperature gets too high, your thermostat detects that and it kicks on the air conditioner, causing the temperature to come back down. That's how negative feedbacks work. in our body. And that's what most of the feedback systems in our body are. However, positive feedbacks, they make it worse before it gets better. They intensify the condition before they make it better. Positive feedbacks, sorry ladies, we have more of those. Positive feedbacks are seen with childbirth. The contractions get worse before they get better because they have to push that baby out. Breastfeeding is another one. There is one that we all have, male and female, and that is bleeding. A lot of times when you get a cut, bleeding gets worse before it gets better because we have to get the clotting factors there in order to make the clot and patch up the problem. So most of our feedback systems in our body are negative, but some are positive. Now, behaviors can also help us in this whole idea of homeostasis. An example is plants' leaves may move towards the sun. You can see where plants might move towards the sun. Reptiles sunbathe or seek shade depending on their body temperature because they are cold-blooded, which is they're really not. They're ectothermic, meaning they rely on the environment for their temperature. And so they'll sunbathe if they're cold or they'll seek shade if they're too hot. So behaviors are also part of this idea of homeostasis. So some examples of factors that some organisms may need to maintain, like internal organisms, are things like temperature. Okay, so if you're too hot, you're going to sweat. If you're too cold, you're going to shiver. Okay, it's to help maintain that temperature. Another one is glucose. Your blood glucose levels are supposed to be at a certain level. If they get too high, we want to release hormones to help with that. If they get too low, we want to also fix that, or we raise them. Water. When you get dehydrated, you get cotton mouth. You also then hold on to more of your urine, so you don't go to the bathroom as often. Those are all going to be examples. Blood pressure is another one. Blood pressure is going to be altered and kind of worked on by your kidneys. pH. pH is going to be the acid-base balance in your body. And so we have some short windows there. And if you were to eat something really acidic like a lemon, we want to make sure that that doesn't get all out of whack and cause issues in your body. And so there are going to be things that are going to help with that homeostasis. So concept question here is, what happens when your body fails to maintain homeostasis? Well, we call that illness or we call that illness. Illnesses can be very mild or they can be very severe. And if they are severe, they could lead to possible death. So some examples of this is if we're looking at those examples above. Temperature, if your temperature gets too high, we call that hyperthermia. If it gets too low, it's hypothermia. If your glucose gets too high, we call it hyperglycemia. If it's too low, it's hypoglycemia. If you have a water issue, this could be dehydration. Blood pressure, you could have hypertension if it's too high or hypotension if it's too low. And we do see if pH becomes an issue and you get too much acid, this can lead to diabetic ketoacidosis, where your blood becomes too acidic and it could cause you to go into a coma. So these are just some examples of when the above issues get out of whack. All right, the next one we have is the theory of ecosystems. This is where all living, which we call biotic organisms, interact with each other and with their physical non-living or abiotic environment. When we add a in front of a word, it means not or without. So abiotic means not living. So individual organisms are going to make up populations. Populations are going to make up communities. And communities, along with their non-living components, are going to make up ecosystems. Those ecosystems then make up planet Earth. Some biotic components are going to, when we look at these ecosystems, include producers, so like your plants, consumers like us, other animals, and decomposers, a lot of times that's bacteria and fungus. Abiotic are the environmental components. These could be things like precipitation, soil type, the amount of light, temperature, and so on. So if you'll note, the abiotic factors like the climates, okay, they're going to determine the type of ecosystem. A desert is determined based on the low precipitation and the temperature that's present, whereas a forest is going to be a little different. So some examples of ecosystems that exhibit very high biodiversity, when we talk about the biotic side, they've got lots of living things. If we're looking at aquatic environments like this would be like coral reefs. Coral reefs have tons of life present in them. If we want to look at on land, terrestrial, one of the best biodiversity types of ecosystems would be the tropical rainforest. There's so many different types of living things that are present there. So ecosystems are characterized by a number of things. First, they need a constant input of energy, and this comes from the sun. This is non-cyclic, meaning that it doesn't return back to the sun, so it just goes through the system. We do see that they do need some efficient continuous chemical cycles. This is things like the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle. So those have to be present in an ecosystem. There also needs to be intricate food webs or chains. The more intricate they are, the better the ecosystem is going to be. So if we look here, here's an example. Food chains obviously are just this eats this, which eats this. But food webs is like what you see here, where you can have lots of different options of what they eat. You'll notice at the base of the food chain or the web is going to be the producers. And then we move up to the top consumers. Now, there are a lot of impacts that us as humans can have on natural ecosystems, and a lot of times they are bad. Every now and then they can be good. We are not considered hunters and gatherers anymore. We don't do that much anymore, and we are a lot more industrialized due to our technology. So how do we impact our natural ecosystems as that relates to energy? Are we positive, negative, or neutral when it comes to energy? Well, we do see that there's a lot of increased demands that are required for us because of the way that we want to live our lives. And so because of this, the idea is we need to try to capture alternative, sustainable, renewable energies. That's a big push, okay, because of the fact that we do require a lot of energy. Now, because of the type of energy that we do have with the non-renewable, sometimes there are accidents that happen like oil spills. These would have obviously a negative impact on our ecosystems. How do we impact our natural ecosystems as it relates to the efficiency of chemical cycles? Do we interrupt the water cycle and the carbon cycle and that sort of thing? Well, we do because of the pollutants that we put out. We have different types of pollution where we have air pollution, land pollution, or water pollution. All of those ultimately are going to be a negative impact on the chemical cycles. This is where there's that big push of going green, where we should try to reduce, reuse, and recycle. How do we impact our natural ecosystem as it relates to biodiversity or food webs? Well, when we look at this, we can end up decreasing biodiversity due to encroachment. We come in too close to those habitats. We cut down those trees. We get rid of certain things. And because of that, it causes an impact on the animals and other things that live there. Again, giving a negative impact. You see that here with the koalas. Koalas are very close to extinction, and some of that is human related, and some of that is also due to natural causes like forest fires and stuff that have taken out some of their homes. Another thing is sometimes we introduce non-native species into an area. We introduce something that shouldn't be there, and so because of it, it grows like crazy and it outcompetes what should be there. Okay, and you can see that here in some of these plants and also with animals. We have to be careful not just to release whatever animal in that place, because it could be where it doesn't even have a predator that will eat it, and so they overpopulate. Another thing is going to be overhunting. Sometimes we overhunt a population, which causes irreparable damage. It cannot then bounce back. So most of the time, again, we are negative impacts on food webs. All right, this brings us then to the theory of evolution. Organisms have shared characteristics because they have common ancestors. Over time, there are changes in the species that are physical or behavioral that change the genes in some way. So I have a gene here on the DNA, a change in the gene structure. Remember, we called that a mutation. This is a type of evolution that we call microevolution, and it's caused sometimes by environment, the environment itself, like the fact that there's something in the air that causes the issue, something you ate, it changes your DNA, or it could just be spontaneous. It just changes for no apparent reason. Now, a change in form or function, we would say adaptation if the change is beneficial. Okay, so if it is beneficial, that is a type of adaptation. Now, adaptation is a physical and or behavioral change that makes an organism better suited for their environment, makes them better at living where they are. Evolution, though, is genetic changes within species that occur over time. This is a concept that Charles Darwin came up with, and he calls it the descent with modification. As our descendants come into play, they have different modifications that help them make them different. Now, evolution leads to the survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest means that whatever organism is most fit for that environment, they will survive. And survival in nature is not just continuing to live longer than other individuals, it's also to produce offspring. You've got to be able to pass your genetics on to the next generation in order to be considered successful in nature. So not only do you have to survive, you also have to produce offspring. Now, modifications or adaptations that occur through this process is called natural selection, where nature is deciding what is beneficial, what is useful, and that's what gets passed on. Now, the fact that some organisms share similar characteristics, that infers a common ancestor, is what allows us to build things that we talked about earlier called phylogenetic trees or cladograms like you see here. And so if you'll notice that anytime a branch comes off, there is a new type of characteristic that came into play. Anything above that characteristic, they have it. Anything below it, they do not. And so this is how they can end up constructing things like cladograms. All right, so this finishes up these notes and this kind of intro to biology. As you go into further videos in this kind of section, you're going to see that we're going to get more specific into like chemistry and cells and even genetics. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to ask.